The stars had never seemed so cold to Captain Alara Vance as they did on that night when her ship drifted through the dead zone between galaxies, and she stood alone on the bridge of the UES Meridian, watching the endless darkness stretch before her like a grave that had no end. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concord nearly 100 years ago, yet they remained outsiders in every way that mattered, and the elder races looked upon them as children playing at being spacefaring beings, calling them infant spacers behind their backs, and sometimes even to their faces. The Meridian was a survey vessel, small and unremarkable, sent to map regions of space that nobody else cared about, and Alara had grown used to the loneliness of her mission, the quiet hum of engines, and the distant twinkling of stars that held no warmth. But on this night, everything changed. The distress signal came through weak and broken, a voice speaking in a language the ship's computer struggled to translate, and when the words finally came through clear enough to understand, Alara felt her heart stop in her chest. "Please," the voice said, trembling with exhaustion and fear. "If anyone can hear us, we are dying, and we have nowhere else to go, and nobody else will answer." Alara ordered her helmsman to change course immediately, ignoring the regulations that told her to report unknown signals before investigating, because something in that voice reached inside her and grabbed hold of her soul. What they found made her crew fall silent in horror. A convoy of ships drifted in the void, their engines dark, and their hulls covered in the frost of deep space. And through the viewports, Alara could see lights flickering inside, the last desperate signs of life struggling against the cold embrace of death. These were Velthari ships. The Velthari were a species that Alara had only heard about in briefings and reports, always described in terms of what they lacked rather than what they possessed, and the galaxy had decided long ago that they were not worth remembering. They had no military to speak of, no weapons that could threaten anyone, and no resources that other species wanted to take. And their bodies were frail and delicate, with translucent skin that glowed with soft bioluminescent light when they were healthy. But centuries ago, a plague called the Withering Blight had swept through their population, damaging their genetic code so badly that they could no longer have children without medical help that cost more than their entire civilization could afford. The Galactic Concord had held a vote, as they always did when facing difficult questions, and the Council of Elder Races had decided that helping the Velthari was not a good use of resources, and so they had classified them as a terminal species. That classification was a death sentence written in bureaucratic language. Aid would stop, all trade routes would close, and all medical research would end, and the Velthari would be given a dying planet in a forgotten corner of space where they could wait quietly for extinction without bothering anyone else. One by one, every civilization in the galaxy had turned away from them, closing their doors and their hearts, and the Velthari had been left alone to face the darkness. Now here they were, the last survivors of a dying people, drifting in ships that were falling apart around them, and nobody had answered their calls for help except a single human vessel that was never supposed to be in this region of space. Alara made a decision that would change the course of history, though she did not know it at the time, and she ordered her crew to begin rescue operations immediately. "Captain," her first officer said, with worry in his voice, "regulations require us to contact command before engaging with unknown vessels, and the Concord has specific rules about terminal species that we are supposed to follow." Alara turned to face him, and her eyes burned with a fire that made him step back. "There are children on those ships," she said, her voice steady and strong, "and they are dying while we stand here talking about regulations. So, you can either help me save them, or you can write your report. But I know which one I am going to do." The first officer nodded and said nothing more, and the crew of the Meridian went to work. When Alara stepped aboard the first Velthari vessel, she had to stop herself from crying at what she saw, because the conditions were worse than anything she had ever witnessed in her years of service. Thousands of Velthari huddled together in corridors that had grown cold because the heating systems had failed weeks ago, and their bioluminescent skin had faded to a dull gray that meant they were close to death. And the smell of sickness hung heavy in the recycled air. An elder Velthari approached her, moving slowly on legs that trembled with each step. And his large eyes were filled with tears that glowed faintly in the dim light. "I am Sorrel," he said, in a voice that cracked with emotion. "And I sent the message, though I did not believe anyone would come, because no one has answered our calls in many years." Alara reached out and took his thin hand in hers, feeling how fragile his bones were beneath his translucent skin. "I am Captain Alara Vance of the United Earthship Meridian," she said, "and I heard you, and we are going to help you." Sorrel stared at her as if he could not understand her words. "Why?" he asked, and the question carried the weight of centuries of abandonment and sorrow. Alara looked around at the dying Velthari, at the children who had stopped crying because they had no energy left, at the parents who held them close and waited for the end. "Because no one should die alone in the air." "Dark," she said, "and because we remember what it was like when nobody cared if we lived or died, and we swore we would never let that happen to anyone else." Human doctors from the Meridian flooded into the Velthari ships, carrying medicine and food and warm blankets, and they worked through the night and the next day and the day after that, refusing to rest while lives hung in the balance. For the first time in generations, the Velthari felt hope. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Galactic Concord, alarms began to sound, as reports came in of a human vessel violating protocols and interfering with the natural order of things. The elder races watched with cold eyes and calculated minds, certain that this foolish act of compassion would teach humanity a lesson about knowing their place in the galaxy. They had no idea what was coming. The news spread across human space like fire through dry grass, and within days, every colony and every station and every ship knew about what Captain Alara Vance had found in the darkness between stars. Videos leaked onto public networks, showing Velthari children with fading bioluminescence, lying in makeshift hospital beds, their large eyes looking up at human doctors who worked desperately to save them, and people who had never cared about alien politics before found themselves unable to look away. Mothers watched and held their own children closer, and fathers felt anger building in their chests, and young people gathered in public squares, demanding that their leaders do something to help these innocent beings who had been left to die by a galaxy that did not care. The United Earth Parliament was forced to hold an emergency session, and politicians who had hoped to ignore the situation found themselves facing crowds of citizens who would not be silenced. Inside the great chamber on Earth, where humanity made its most important decisions, representatives argued back and forth about what should be done, and many spoke of the risks and the costs and the damage this could do to humanity's position in the Galactic Concord. "We are still newcomers," one senator said with fear in his voice, "and if we anger the elder races, they could crush us, and is it worth risking everything we have built for a species that is already doomed?" The chamber erupted in angry shouts from those who disagreed, and the speaker called for order again and again, until finally the room fell quiet as an old man in a military uniform stood up to speak. Admiral Yusuf Okonkwo had fought in the border wars before humanity joined the Concord, and his face bore scars from battles that most people only read about in history books. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much death in his long life. "I have heard my colleagues talk about risks, he began, and I have heard them talk about costs, and I have heard them talk about our position among the stars, as if it were something precious that must be protected at any price. He paused and looked around the chamber, at the faces of those who held the future of humanity in their hands. Let me tell you what I see, he continued, because I am old enough to remember things that many of you have forgotten, and I remember when humanity was alone on a small blue planet with nobody to help us. And I remember plagues that killed millions while the world watched and did nothing. The chamber was silent now, every eye fixed on the old admiral. We were not always spacefaring, he said, and there was a time when our ancestors looked up at the stars and wondered if anyone out there would care if we lived or died. And the answer was no, because the universe is cold and vast and does not care about small creatures struggling. To survive, he walked slowly toward the center of the chamber, his boots echoing on the marble floor. But we survived, he said, not because we were strong or smart or lucky, but because we refused to give up on each other, and because when times were darkest, we reached out our hands to lift each other up instead of pushing each other down. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, filling the chamber with passion that made some representatives wipe tears from their eyes. The Velthari are dying, he said, and the galaxy has decided they are not worth saving, and they have asked for our help. And now we must decide what kind of species we will be. He stopped in the center of the chamber and turned in a slow circle, meeting the eyes of every representative who watched him. Will we be like the elder races who calculate the value of life in terms of resources and power, he asked? Or will we be something better, something that remembers what it means to be small and afraid and alone? The chamber erupted in applause that went on and on until the speaker gave up trying to restore order. And when the vote was finally called, the result was unanimous in a way that had never happened before in the history of the Parliament. Humanity would grant the Velthari asylum and full protection. The announcement went out across all channels and all frequencies, and on the refugee ships that drifted in the care of the Meridian, the Velthari heard the news and wept with joy, their bioluminescence flickering back to life as hope returned to their hearts. Elder Sorrel stood beside Captain Vance on the bridge of her ship and watched the message play again and again, unable to believe what he was hearing. Why? He asked, just as he had asked before. Why would your people risk everything for us when we have nothing to offer in return? Ilara smiled and put her hand on his shoulder. She said, and because we know what it feels like to be forgotten. The reaction from the Galactic Concord came swiftly and harshly, as the elder races made their displeasure known through official channels and unofficial threats. The hegemonic Cathari, an ancient empire of reptilian beings who had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years, issued a formal statement calling humanity's actions sentimental foolishness that demonstrates their immaturity as a spacefaring species. The crystalline Oryx Collective, beings of pure logic who existed as networks of living crystal, calculated that humanity had decreased their galactic viability rating by 34% through this single act of compassion. Trade partners began to withdraw from agreements with Earth, and economic sanctions started to mount, and diplomatic messages arrived daily, warning humanity to reconsider their decision before it was too late. But something strange happened that the elder races did not expect. NP. Humanity did not care. The threats and the sanctions and the warnings only made human resolve grow stronger, and people who had never paid attention to politics before began to organize and prepare for whatever might come. Volunteers flooded recruitment centers, not to fight but to help, offering their skills as doctors and engineers and teachers and builders, and ships filled with supplies headed toward the refugee convoy from every corner of human space. The Velthari watched in amazement as this young species that the galaxy dismissed as primitive and foolish rallied around them with a passion that they had never seen before. And on the bridge of the Meridian, Captain Alara Vance received new orders from Admiral Okonkwo himself, orders that would take the refugee convoy to a world where they could finally find peace. The destination was New Eden, a beautiful colony world with green continents and blue oceans. Humanity was preparing to welcome their new friends with open arms. The galaxy watched and wondered if they had made a terrible mistake in underestimating these strange beings called humans. But they would not understand the truth until it was far too late. The refugee ships descended through the clouds of New Eden on a morning when the twin suns painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. And thousands of Velthari pressed their faces against viewports to see the world that would become their new home. For beings who had spent generations on dying ships and barren rocks, the sight of green forests and sparkling rivers was almost too beautiful to bear, and many of them wept as they watched the land rise up to meet them. Humanity had prepared for their arrival with the kind of energy and enthusiasm that baffled the rest of the galaxy. And when the ships landed, they found entire cities rising from the ground, built by human volunteers who had worked day and night to create homes for their new friends. The southern continent had been set aside for the Velthari, and human engineers had designed buildings that matched their needs, with soft lighting and gentle curves and spaces that felt warm and welcoming instead of cold and sterile. Harsh. Dr. Marcus Chen arrived on New Eden with the first wave of medical specialists, a young geneticist with kind eyes and a brilliant mind who had volunteered to lead the most important project in human history. Project Everlight was its name, and its goal was nothing less than curing the withering blight that had haunted the Velthari for centuries. The challenge seemed impossible to many, because the plague had damaged Velthari DNA in ways that were incredibly complex, and the elder races had declared long ago that no cure could ever be found, which was why they had given up and abandoned the Velthari to their fate. But humans had a habit of doing things that others said were impossible, and Dr. Chen gathered a team of the best scientists from Earth and every colony world, determined to prove the galaxy wrong. Among the Velthari refugees was a young girl named Lyrian, barely 10 years old by human counting, whose bioluminescence had faded so much that she could barely glow at all, and the doctor said she might only have a few years left to live. She was brought to Dr. Chen's laboratory for testing, one patient among thousands, but something about her caught his attention and would not let go. Maybe it was the way she looked at the world with wonder instead of fear, or maybe it was how she asked questions about everything she saw, with a curiosity that reminded him of himself when he was young. Whatever the reason, Lyrian and Dr. Chen became friends, and their friendship would become a symbol of the bond between their two peoples. "Why do humans help us?" Lyrian asked him one day, as she sat in his lab watching him work, her large eyes reflecting the glow of computer screens. "Everyone else said we were not worth saving, so why are you different?" Dr. Chen stopped what he was doing and knelt down to look at her face to face. "Because a long time ago, before we went to the stars, humans learned something important," he said. "We learned that the measure of who you are is not what you have or what you can do, but how you treat others who need help." Lyrian thought about this for a moment. "But helping us is hard and dangerous," she said, "and other species are angry at you. So why not just let us die and make your life easier?" Dr. Chen smiled and shook his head. "Because easy is not the same as right," he said. "And my people would rather do what is right, even when it is hard." As months passed, the bond between humans and Velthari grew stronger, in ways that surprised everyone, and the galaxy began to see that the species they had dismissed as useless had gifts that no one had bothered to notice before. The Velthari were artists unlike any the universe had ever known, and their bioluminescent paintings seemed to capture emotions in ways that made viewers weep with joy or ache with longing. And their music touched something deep in the human soul that words could not quite express, could not describe. Philosophers and poets emerged from among them, beings who had spent centuries contemplating the nature of existence while the galaxy ignored them. And their wisdom attracted scholars from across human space who came to learn at their feet. Cultural festivals celebrated both species, with human children learning Velthari dances and Velthari children playing human games. And the continent that had been given to the refugees became a place of beauty and creativity that drew visitors from every colony. But while Sanctuary grew stronger, darkness gathered at the edges. The Kethari hegemony had been watching and waiting, growing angrier with each passing day as humanity refused to bow to their demands. And High Arbiter Fesk, the cold-blooded ruler of the ancient empire, decided that the time had come to teach these young upstarts a lesson they would never forget. Economic sanctions increased until human trade ships found themselves turned away from ports across the galaxy, and species that had once been friendly now refused to even acknowledge human communications. 3 other members of the Galactic Concord joined the Kethari in demanding that humanity surrender the Velthari to Concord custody for managed decline, which was a polite way of saying they would be placed on a reservation and allowed to slowly die out. The ultimatum arrived on Admiral Okonkwo's desk on a morning when the sun was shining and children were playing in the streets of New Eden, and he read it with a face that showed no emotion at all. "They want us to give up the Velthari," his aide said quietly, "or they will expel us from the Concord and treat us as enemies." Admiral Okonkwo looked out the window at the world that humanity had built, at the Velthari families walking alongside human neighbors, at the children of both species chasing each other through parks and laughing without any care for the politics of them. "Galaxy, draft a response," he said finally, his voice calm and steady. "What should it say, sir?" The old admiral turned to face his aide with fire burning in his eyes. "Tell them that we will build our own society if we must," he said, "and tell them that ours will remember mercy." The message was sent, and the galaxy held its breath, and everyone knew that war was coming. The Kethari fleet arrived on a day when the clouds over New Eden were dark and heavy with coming rain, and from the surface the ships appeared as tiny points of light that multiplied until they filled the sky like a swarm of angry stars. 200 warships formed a ring around the planet, their weapons powered and ready, and behind them came supply vessels and troop transports, carrying enough soldiers to crush any resistance that humanity might offer. High Arbiter Fesk commanded from his flagship, a massive vessel called the Eternal Dominion that had brought death to 100 worlds across 10,000 years of Kethari conquerors. And he looked upon New Eden with the cold satisfaction of a predator cornering its prey. But he did not intend to attack, at least not at first, because the Kethari were patient hunters who preferred to let their enemies weaken themselves before delivering the final blow. The blockade would strangle New Eden slowly, supplies and reinforcements, until the humans grew desperate enough to surrender. And then the Velthari would be taken away, and humanity would learn its place in the natural order of the galaxy. "They are children playing at war," Fesk said to his officers, as they watched the human defense fleet take position between the blockade and the planet. "And children must be taught to respect their elders." The United Earth Defense Fleet was small compared to the Kethari Armada, barely 50 ships, led by Admiral Okonkwo himself aboard the UEDS Horizon, but they held their position with a determination that puzzled the ancient reptilian commander. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and the blockade tightened like a noose around New Eden's throat. Food began to run short as supply ships were turned away or destroyed, and medicine became precious as warehouses emptied and could not be refilled, and the people of New Eden faced a choice between surrendering and slowly starving. But something happened that Thesk had not predicted and could not understand. The humans did not break. Instead of fighting each other for scraps, as other species had done under similar pressure, humans and Velthari shared what little they had, dividing rations equally, and making sure that children ate before adults, and the sick received care before the healthy. Gardens appeared on rooftops and in parks, as people planted vegetables in every patch of soil they could find. And engineers worked to recycle and conserve resources in ways that stretched supplies far beyond what should have been possible. Morale remained high, even as bellies grew empty, and people gathered in public squares to sing songs and tell stories and remind each other why they were fighting. One night a Cathari commander grew impatient and broadcast a demand for immediate surrender on all frequencies, expecting to hear the desperate pleas of a broken population. Instead, a child's voice answered, clear and strong across the void of space. "We are not leaving our friends," the voice said simply. The broadcast was picked up by ships throughout the sector and spread across the galaxy within hours, and beings on 1,000 worlds heard those words and felt something stir in their hearts that they had thought long dead. Cracks began to appear in the alliance that Thesk had built, as species who had joined the blockade started to question whether they were on the right side of history. The Morveth, an aquatic race who had themselves been dismissed by the Concords centuries ago, began sending secret supply shipments through gaps in the blockade, risking destruction to help people they had never met. Even the Oryx Collective, those beings of pure logic and calculation, found their equations producing results they could not explain, showing that humanity's chances of survival were increasing despite all rational analysis suggesting they should be decreasing. Thesk grew angry at these developments and decided that a show of force was needed to remind everyone of Cathari power. He ordered a strike group to board and capture a human hospital ship that had been treating wounded civilians, believing that this would demonstrate the futility of resistance and break the spirit of the defenders. The attack came without warning, Cathari assault shuttles swarming toward the medical vessel like predators descending on wounded prey. But the humans did not run, and they did not surrender. Captain Yuki Tanaka commanded the hospital ship's small escort, just 3 frigates against a dozen Cathari warships, and she knew that the odds were impossible. But she also knew that there were 2,000 patients aboard that ship who were counting on her. "All hands to battle stations," she announced through the intercom, her voice steady, despite the fear that gripped her heart. "We hold the line here, whatever the cost." The battle was brief and brutal, lasting less than an hour, but feeling like an eternity to those who fought. Human ships darted between the larger Cathari vessels, using speed and cunning to compensate for their lack of firepower, and pilots flew with a reckless courage that stunned their enemies. 2 human frigates were destroyed, their crews lost to the cold vacuum of space, and the third was badly damaged, with Captain Tanaka wounded at her post. But when the smoke cleared and the debris settled, the hospital ship remained unharmed, and the Cathari strike group had retreated in disarray, leaving behind the wreckage of 4 of their own warships. It was the first time in recorded galactic history that a junior species had successfully repelled a hegemony military assault. News of the battle spread like wildfire, and suddenly the narrative that the Cathari had built began to crumble. Was not weak, and humanity was not foolish, and humanity would not abandon those they had sworn to protect, no matter what the cost. More species began to question the blockade openly, and protests erupted on worlds that had never cared about the Velthari before. And High Arbiter Thesk found himself facing something he had never encountered in his long life. He was facing people who would rather die than betray their friends. Deep beneath the surface of New Eden, in a laboratory that had never stopped working, even as the world above faced starvation and siege, Dr. Marcus Chen stared at his computer screen, with tears streaming down his face. The data was clear, and the results were confirmed after months of testing and retesting, and he could barely breathe as he realized what he was looking at. They had done it. Project Everlight had succeeded, and the cure for the withering blight was real. The treatment was elegant in its simplicity, a genetic therapy that repaired the damage to Velthari DNA and restored their ability to reproduce naturally. And the first trials had worked perfectly on volunteer patients who had given up hope long ago. Dr. Chen walked slowly through the corridors of the underground complex until he reached a small room where a young Velthari girl sat reading a book about human history. And when she looked up at him with her large eyes, he felt his heart swell with joy. "Lyrian," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I have something to tell you." She put down her book and tilted her head in that curious way she had. "What is it, Dr. Chen?" she asked. He knelt down beside her and took her thin hand in his, just as Captain Vance had once taken Elder Sorrel's hand on a dying ship in the darkness between stars. "You are going to live," he said, "and your children are going to live, and your children's children are going to live, because we found the cure, and your people are going to survive." Lyrian stared at him for a long moment as the words sank in, and then her bioluminescence blazed to life brighter than it had ever been, filling the room with brilliant blue light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her beating heart. She threw her arms around him and held on tight, and neither of them could stop crying. The news spread first through New Eden, where people who had been rationing food and medicine suddenly found themselves dancing in the streets despite the warships that still hung in the sky above. Then it reached the blockade fleet, where Cathari officers exchanged worried glances as they realized that the narrative they had built was collapsing around them. And then it spread across the galaxy, carried by every communication network and broadcast on every frequency. And beings on 10,000 worlds learned that the species they had abandoned as worthless had been saved by the species they had dismissed as primitive. The Velthari were not dying anymore. Humanity had done what the entire Galactic Concord said was impossible, and they had done it while under siege by one of the most powerful empires in known space. Protests that had been simmering on distant worlds erupted into full-scale demonstrations, and citizens demanded to know why their governments had participated in the slow murder of an innocent species. The alliance that High Arbiter Thesk had built fractured and shattered as member species withdrew their ships and issued formal apologies. And within weeks, only the Cathari fleet remained in orbit around New Eden. But even the ancient hegemony could not withstand the tide of change. Military officers who had served Thesk loyally for centuries began to question his judgment, and political rivals who had been waiting for a moment of weakness finally saw their opportunity. The High Arbiter was deposed in a bloodless coup, arrested by his own guards, and dragged away to face trial for crimes against sentient beings. The blockade dissolved like morning mist under the rising sun, and supply ships from a dozen worlds raced to New Eden, carrying food and medicine and messages of support from species who had once looked away. In the aftermath of the crisis, representatives from across the galaxy gathered to discuss what should be done next, and to the surprise of many, it was humanity that they asked to lead the conversation. The Galactic Concord had failed, they admitted, because it had been built on principles of power and calculation rather than compassion and justice, and a new organization was needed that would learn from the mistakes of the past. Admiral Okonkwo and Elder Sorrel sat together at a table, surrounded by ambassadors from 100 species, and together they wrote the founding charter of what would become known as the Terran Accord. "No species shall be abandoned," the first line read, "and no voice shall be silenced, and we rise together, or we fall alone." The words were simple, but their meaning was profound, and when the representatives voted to adopt the charter, the result was unanimous. 50 years passed, and the galaxy changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Velthari flourished on New Eden and spread to other worlds, their population growing as children were born healthy and strong for the first time in centuries, and their art and music and philosophy enriched every culture they touched. Dr. Chen became the most celebrated scientist in human history, honored with awards and titles from species across the galaxy, but he always said that his greatest achievement was watching Lyrian grow up healthy and happy. Humans and Velthari built colonies together, explored the unknown reaches of space together, and faced challenges together as partners and friends. And on the 50th anniversary of the day when Captain Alara Vance answered a desperate call in the darkness, a ceremony was held on New Eden to commemorate all that had happened since. Ambassador Lyrian stood before an audience of beings from 100 different species, her bioluminescence shining brighter than any Velthari in recorded history, and she spoke of the humans who had saved her people when no one else would. 50 years ago we were dying, she said, her voice carrying across the great hall, out to the billions watching on screens throughout the galaxy. And the universe had decided that we were not worth saving, and we had accepted that our story was ending. She paused and looked out at the faces in the crowd, at the humans and Velthari sitting side by side, at the representatives of species who had once turned away, but had now learned to reach out. But then they came, she continued, these strange beings called humans, who refused to accept what everyone else believed, who looked at us and saw not a burden, but a family waiting to be found. Tears glistened in her eyes as she spoke the final words that would be carved in stone and remembered for generations. They taught us something the galaxy had forgotten, she said, that the measure of a civilization is not its power or its wealth or its technology, but its compassion. She smiled and spread her arms wide as if embracing the entire universe. And that is why we will never forget them, and why we will spend eternity trying to be worthy of the gift they gave us. The audience rose to their feet in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. And somewhere in the crowd, an old man named Marcus Chen wiped tears from his eyes as he watched the girl he had once saved, now leading her people into a future bright with promise. And outside, beyond the walls and the city and the atmosphere itself, the stars shone down with a light that no longer seemed cold. Because humanity had taught the galaxy that the universe was not empty and uncaring after all. It was simply waiting for someone brave enough to reach out and prove that kindness was the greatest power of them all.